I don't think of humanism as being a religion. It doesn't much bother me whether you call it a religion or not. It rather depends on what you mean by that. Yeah, I don't think of it as a religion because, it involves no kind of supernatural commitment, and it's broadly sceptical in the sense that it thinks that people should apply their powers of reason as best they're able. But that's not to say that, reliance on reason is itself then some sort of faith position.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon Sense in Current Times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm real excited to be here with Dr. Stephen Law. He is a British philosopher, educator, and author. He specializes in the philosophy of religion, ethics, and critical thinking. He is the author of Humanism, a very short introduction, The War for Children's Minds, The Philosophy Gem. He now serves as the editor of Think, a journal of philosophy for the general public, published by the Royal Institute of Philosophy and Cambridge University Press. I've watched Dr. Law debate with William Lane Craig and Peter Akins, and he has a very accessible style and a sharp argument. He's recognized for formulating the Evil God Challenge, which is a philosophical critique aimed at the moral coherence of traditional theism. I'm just excited to have him on here to talk with him about humanism. So, Dr. Law, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you being here.
No, not at all. It's my pleasure.
So let's just kind of start just a quick summary of like what is humanism? I know about it from my college days. I read Foucault, I read some Hume, back in the day. But just can you kind of give me just a real quick version of what is humanism?
Sure. Well, it's a term that has a lot of different uses. And so I wrote this, I should wave it about maybe, this book on humanism for the very short introduction series, Oxford University Press. And in that book, I attempt to explain what humanism means so far as campaigning humanist organisations are concerned. For example, so in the UK, we have Humanists UK. In America, you have the American Humanist Association, I believe. There's international humanist organisations and so on. And so they have various concerns and commitments. And I'm really just setting out that. In America, I believe you tend to call it secular humanism. Yes. Whereas in the UK, we tend to just call it humanism. But it's the same thing we're talking about. Yeah, so... so far as I'm concerned, a humanist is either an atheist or at least agnostic. As far as God is concerned, they're not committed to that. They're committed to applying reason and science as far as these things can be applied. That's not to say that every question can be answered by reason and science. It's not a commit to scientism, as it's sometimes called. But we should apply reason and science as best as and as far as we're able. Humanists believe that a meaningful life can be had in the absence of God and religion. Humanists very often have fairly strong moral commitments, and they mount a moral case for doing this or that. They value in particular moral autonomy. So they think individuals should be encouraged to take on the responsibility for making their own moral judgments rather than deferring to some external authority. So, under a totalitarian communist regime, for example, you might be encouraged to defer to your local communist party for sure when it comes to moral issues. Humanists would reject that. They say that, no, it's your responsibility. You need to think for yourself and not just passively accept what someone else has told you. It's an unavoidable responsibility. And then perhaps the most important thing is that humanists are political secularists. So this is very often at the heart of the sort of campaigning humanist organisation. This concern that there should be, as you put it in the States, separation of church and state. that the state should be neutral on matters of religion, so it shouldn't be promoting religion, but neither should it be promoting atheism. It should simply keep out of that debate. It shouldn't take sides, shouldn't privilege one view over another, religious or non-religious. And the state should protect our freedoms to either worship and express our religious views openly, or alternatively to criticise religious beliefs. So that's a sort of 7-point characterisation of what I take humanism to be. And I guess one interesting thing about it is that there's considerable potential overlap there between humanists and religious people. I mean, a lot of religious people are political secularists. A lot of religious people would probably say, well, actually, no, you could have a meaningful life in the absence of God and religion and so on. So, and they want to apply science and reason as far as these things can be applied. So there's potentially a great deal of agreement between humanists and religious people, and indeed they can even join forces, on some campaign issues. So, for example, in the UK a few years ago, there was a campaign for a sort of secular Britain, political secularism. And, we had Roman Catholic priests on that campaign, campaigning for political secularism, for the separation of church and state, for giving equal rights to religious and non-religious people rather than favouring one group over another. So that's my brief sort of outline.
All right, and so I'm curious, because when I look at humanism, almost the way you describe it, and there's the community piece of it, there's moral framework behind it. It almost seems to be a type of reason that's that's not a theistic type religion, but it almost seems to be a religion. Is there a distinction between humanism and as a religion where you almost worship reason? Is that possible?
Well, I wouldn't say we worship reason, because we would apply reason to reason and think critically about that. Should everything be based on reason? It's the kind of question we're going to ask. So it's not like a faith position. I mean, literally everything is open to critical scrutiny, including the suggestion that everything should be open to critical scrutiny. So it's not a faith position in that sense. Sometimes humanists are accused of being religious, and sometimes they even characterise themselves as being religious, and it does have political advantages, because religions very often have privileges that other organisations do not. So, for example, in Europe, religions get funding, and because humanism is recognised as a religion, as are various other strange religions that have started up, such as the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and so on.
Right.
So the state has to then provide funding to humanists and to the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and so on. So there's one motivation for calling yourself a religion. I don't think of humanism as being a religion. It doesn't much bother me whether you call it a religion or not. It rather depends on what you mean by that. But I don't think of it as a religion, because it involves no kind of supernatural commitment, and it's broadly sceptical in the sense that it thinks that people should apply their powers of reason as best they're able. But that's not to say that reliance on reason is itself then some sort of faith position.
So
for the reason I just explained.
Right, you explained faith. You bring that up a couple times. How are you defining faith in this context? Like I had faith that this was going to work, but I don't understand.
Yeah.
I know it's going to work based off of my experience, but I had more faith that it was going to work. The science of understanding. I can talk to you in UK this way.
I mentioned the word faith because you mentioned the word religion.
Right.
In respect to humanism, you said, isn't humanism a religion? And faith in reason, you suggested, was something that humanists sign up to, and so that's why I started using the term.
Okay.
As to what it means, well, it means various different things. So there are religious faiths, plural. There's Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and so on. Faith can also mean placing your trust in something. I have faith in my bank manager; he's not going to run off with all my money, and so on.
Right.
It can mean belief in the absence of evidence, or perhaps, not much evidence, but, you're going to have faith anyway that things are going to work out. You're going to be optimistic, say. So the word faith is used in a variety of different ways. I'm not sure any of these really apply to humanism. I mean, sometimes humanists get accused by John Gray, for example, philosopher and thinker, of being utopian and optimistic. We humanists think that if you just apply reason as best you can, ultimately we'll enter a sort of brave new world, and all of humanity's problems will be solved, and things can only get better. And there are thinkers like Steven Pinker, very famous academic, who wrote a book on enlightenment and how the world under enlightenment just keeps getting better and better and better, and that's basically as a result of our applying our powers of reason as best we can. So there certainly are people that are very optimistic, but as I characterised humanism, you don't have to be optimistic. You could be quite pessimistic, actually. You could think that our best bet is to apply reason as best we can, but there's no guarantee that reason will prevail. In fact, reason is up against various other sort of methods of producing belief that are causally far more powerful than reason is. All sorts of things that you can apply: repetition, emotional manipulation, peer pressure, and so on, can be used to shape people's beliefs, often extremely effectively. And then trying to use reason to convince these people that they might have got it wrong can be an uphill battle, and I'm not entirely confident that we'd always win.
Did you know that sitting all day can significantly impact blood circulation? I mean, look up, there's a ton of research on it. Your leg and calf muscles help pump blood back to your heart. So when you sit, blood pools in your legs. And further studies show that sitting decreases nitric oxide production, making vessels less able to expand. This is why, like in the afternoons, or if you've been sitting for a long time, you start noticing low energy, brain fog, or just kind of feeling a step slower. It might be creeping in on you after a while. And a lot of that could be linked to your circulation. So Juvedon has created Blood Flow 7. It is designed to support healthy nitric oxide levels, which helps your blood vessels relax, open up, improving oxygen and nutrient delivery to your brain, heart, and muscles. That means better stamina, mental clarity, and overall vitality without caffeine or stimulants. It's made with clinically studied natural ingredients, and in research, these have been shown to boost nitric oxide by as much as 230% in just a few hours. It helps open arteries for smoother blood flow. So there's just 2 easy capsules a day. There's no mess, no fuss, and you're supporting your heart health, your healthy blood pressure, and more energy to power through the day. So check it out at bloodflow7, that's the number 7.com/uncommon, or you can click the link in the description. That's bloodflow number 7, so bloodflow7.com/uncommon. It is just common sense. So, but when you think about reason in that situation, and again, I listened to a couple of your debates, and whether or not it was with Peter Akins, who is a very aggressive atheist, I would argue, and then William Lane Craig, who is a very strong apologist. In both those situations, I would argue they used reason quite well, and you used reason quite well in response. So how do you determine then which reason actually, because if by using it in that sense, it seems like there isn't coming up with an answer. I mean, obviously, at the end of both those debates, the people that came in, there might be some in the middle that were kind of swayed one direction or another. But for the most part, both sides could sit there and say, well, my side showed reasonably that this is the case. Like, through reason. How do you deal with those disagreements?
Well, you try to use reason, but it may be that in certain debates, reason is simply not in a position to settle it one way or another, or at least it is in a position to settle it now. I mean, should we embrace string theory in physics? Some people say we should, others say we shouldn't. It may be that, the jury's out and we simply can't decide, and that's the verdict that reason suggests really that you should take. You should sit on the fence for the time being. So similarly then, when you look at other debates, it may be that reason fails to produce a verdict. However, sometimes reason produces a verdict and people won't accept it or refuse to see it. So, for example, there are some Christians who believe that the entire universe is less than 10,000 years old. I mean, many millions of them, and some of them are probably smarter than you or I.
Right.
Some of them very well educated and they hold PhDs and so on. These people are using reason. Certainly they believe that they are. And we provide evidence that the universe is really a lot older than 10,000 years and that creatures have evolved over time and so on. But they just won't shift. Reason is never going to shift them. And they believe that reason fails to settle the debate. But of course, it does settle the debate. And what's really going on here is something else. People have when you're dealing with religion and belief in the supernatural more generally, people often have commitments that are extremely well entrenched, and they will use their intelligence to defend the position that they have adopted, come what may. And any position, no matter how ludicrous, can always be defended, come what may, by cooking up ever more ingenious explanations for all of the evidence against what you believe. At the end of the day, you're not being reasonable, but it's not that difficult to convince yourself that you are being reasonable. And so sometimes that's what's going on. And I think that's what's going on with, say, young Earth creationism, for example.
What do you do, though, as a humanist and a philosopher, to protect yourself from that same type of problem where you've been so entrenched in humanism, you could fall victim to that as well? How do you protect yourself from doing that?
Yeah, well, you have to be on your guard. I wrote a book called Believing Bullshit a few years ago, which sort of looks at the reasons why people get sucked into belief systems that then kind of imprison them. And they're convinced that they're the reasonable and rational ones, and everyone outside is somehow missing the arguments or failing to recognise the truth. And the truth is that we're all vulnerable to some extent to that, and you have to kind of constantly check that you're not actually engaging in patterns of thought that merely look like they're reasonable, but on closer examination are not really very reasonable at all. So, for example, an example of that would be consistently explaining away the evidence. If you have a political view, people are often very passionate about their political views, and then they'll go online and they'll be exposed to a range of other political views and political people who are offering counter arguments to what they believe. And sometimes they may present very powerful arguments against what someone believes. And at that point, it's very tempting to just start cooking up explanations. Well, that's fake news. This person is biased. Whatever it might happen to be, you find a way of dismissing the evidence, of explaining it away, of putting things down to bias or misrepresentation or whatever it might happen to be. And in that way, you kind of maintain the illusion that you're being reasonable. And so one of the things that you do when you kind of engage in critical thinking is you subject yourself to an investigation of that sort. Am I doing that? You check yourself for your own biases, your own cognitive biases and so on. And, no one is going to be 100% successful at doing that. I catch myself falling for fallacies and so on. I catch myself engaging in a bit of wishful thinking every now and then, or just explaining away evidence that really I should be engaging with. We all do that, and that's the best we can do. Applying reason as best we can is really our only defence against that. I can't really think of any other way of doing it. So that's what we need to do.
So when you're dealing with things that aren't reason based, and you might disagree with this, because again, in your debate with Akins, you were talking about like objective morality. You're talking about how do you deal with things such as right, wrong, evil, good? How do you deal with that as a humanist? Because without having a standard of right, wrong, good, and evil. And I know you've dealt with this issue many times, but I don't know how do you handle that?
Yeah. Well, it's a very complicated question, and philosophers are divided over whether we should be sort of moral realists or moral anti-realists, whether there are objective moral facts out there to which we're answerable, or whether there aren't. And there are many different moral theories. So, you could be a utilitarian, or you could be a Kantian, or you could be a virtue ethicist, and so on. Now, all of those the only one that's not available really to the humanist is sort of divine command theory, or any view of morality which roots it essentially in God. But all of the other alternatives are available to humanists, and there's no particular kind of theory that they're obligated to sign up to. It's a good question. What is the basis of morality, and how do we know what's right from wrong? And there are many different answers to that, but philosophers generally don't lean towards, God is the answer. Only around about 17% of professional philosophers even lean towards theism. So it's not a particularly popular answer when it comes to that question. I think one of the concerns that I would have about people pressing that question is that it's not, and is widely considered not to be, a particularly good argument for the existence of God, the kind of moral argument. But it's extremely popular with apologists. And the reason it's extremely popular with apologists is because it has emotional leverage. You can induce a kind of moral panic in people by going, but if there's no God, then anything goes, and there is no morality, and right and wrong are just whatever I say they are, and let's just go with that. We that's what you're going to have to accept if you don't sign up to theism. And comparatively few philosophers would agree with that. I don't think it's true, but boy, is it psychologically effective. People get very quickly really quite panicky, and so it has considerable emotional leverage, despite the fact that it's not widely considered to be a terribly good, academic argument for the existence of God.
But when you have somebody who is clinically a sociopath or a narcissist, and they're using their reason, obviously their determination of what is good and evil is warped when it comes to society in general. Again, how do we deal with that? Like, as a humanist, how do we deal with that in practical terms?
Yeah, okay, so there are a number of different issues here. There's, what makes things right and wrong, and there's how do we know about what's right and wrong, and then, what are we going to do about this particular person that's doing bad stuff, right? Right. Okay, now, we can, if somebody's doing bad stuff, we can attempt to rehabilitate them, we can lock them up, we can apply deterrence and so on. So you can control people's behaviour in that kind of way, and we can do that very effectively. So in terms of what you do practically, there's that. If somebody is going around as a serial killer, we'll hunt them down and we'll put them in prison. So that's not a problem. We can do that. In terms of persuading them that what they're doing is wrong, it may be that they simply don't get it. I mean, about 1 in 100 people is a psychopath, and they're kind of born with a kind of a lack of empathy, and they can't really understand what it is that we're talking about, perhaps, when we talk about right and wrong. Actually, is that true? I'm not sure that is true. Maybe they can understand it because they are, in a court of law, found guilty. They know it's wrong. They know they shouldn't be doing it. Actually, we do say that. So I'm not an expert on psychopaths, I have to say. But here's what you can say to a psychopath. You can say, we're not going to allow you to do that because it's wrong. You can try and convince them, but it may not work because they're a psychopath. Other people, on the other hand, they are doing wrong things, but you can kind of bring them round. I mean, people that are horribly racist, for example, we know that there are certain ways of approaching them that are likely to be highly ineffective, possibly counterproductive. If you just push your finger into their chest and start screaming abuse at them, that's only going to make things worse. Right. On the other hand, if you approach them from the point of view of empathy, and in particular get them to think about a time when they were a victim of some injustice, about which they felt very strongly, if you start from that position, very often they become much more receptive suddenly to the thought that actually these other people are being treated very unjustly, and possibly they need to rethink their own behaviour and so on, and they're going to be more willing to listen to the evidence and the arguments than they were previously. So I think that if you're just dealing with a regular human being with a sense of empathy, which you usually are, there's plenty you can do to kind of bring people around and change their minds.
How do you explain, though, the people that were one way until they became a Christian and then they changed? Where they were not necessarily an atheist per se, but they may have been a racist, and then they had an encounter with Christ or through a Christian or something like that. How do you explain that?
Well, it may be that religion has certain causal effects on people, so it may be that it can make people behave better. If you believe something, your behaviour may change. If I believe I'm going to win the lottery next week, I sincerely believe that, my behaviour is going to be very noticeably different. I'm suddenly going to start spending a lot of money. I may start giving money away to other people because I know I'm going to get the money back next week. So, of course, your behaviour is going to change as a result of a change in your beliefs. That doesn't mean that the beliefs are true. It just means that, those beliefs have causal powers, sometimes good, sometimes bad. I think that religion can have good effects on people. There's some evidence to suggest that religious people are a bit more charitable. For example, on the other hand, much of this evidence is based on self-reporting, and you can't always trust self-reporting. So, for example, if you ask Americans, I believe this is true, if you ask Americans, did you go to church last week? So many say yes, that there are not enough pews in the United States of America to accommodate them all.
Right.
Okay, they're not telling you the truth. They're deluding themselves. So given that these kind of reports are based on self-reporting, you have to be a little bit careful. And then there's also, evidence that actually religion can be, have a downside, can have a negative impact on people's lives too. But these are all interesting questions, the extent to which religion is good for people or is useful. But you need to separate that out away from whether or not it's true. Lies can be useful. Sometimes we lie to our children. We say, if you're good, you'll get a present from Santa. But if you're bad, it's going to be cold on Christmas Day. And remember, Santa's invisible and he's always watching. Okay, so now that's pretty powerful. If you get them to believe that, it's going to have a very positive effect on their behaviour. But it's a lie. I'm not entirely sure we should be telling that lie, despite the good effects that it has. So similarly with other beliefs, you can point to the fact that it's very useful and maybe has good outcomes. That doesn't mean it's true, or we should be promoting it.
So do these ideas of racism, lying, etc., again, from a humanist perspective, and I know you mentioned there's different ways of looking at it, but from a humanist perspective, or from your perspective, maybe I should ask, why is that wrong? Why is lying wrong? Why is racism wrong? Where do you get that rooted from? Where does that moral code start from? Do you think it's a utilitarian approach? Do you think it's something else? Where do you think?
I lean towards kind of consequentialism, at least. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism, but not super strongly. I don't really have a very strong commitment to a particular moral theory. I do think that human flourishing, if anything is true, surely this is true, that morality should be tied up with human flourishing. A moral system that results in a complete collapse of human flourishing, well, that can't be a moral system. Surely that's it, by definition, right? But if that's true, then morality is kind of deeply connected to human flourishing. Well, now human flourishing is something that we can investigate, and in fact, we are investigating it and discovering things that are quite surprising. There's a kind of scientists are looking at this, and they're discovering that, for example, beyond getting a certain amount of money per year, it doesn't really have any effect on your happiness. There's a kind of a threshold beyond which it doesn't make you any happier. It turns out that winning the lottery doesn't really make people happier. After about 6 months, they kind of regress to the mean. At the same time, losing a leg which you would think would make you extremely unhappy. Well, it does make you very unhappy, but you tend to regress to the mean again. You tend to go back to more or less the levels of happiness that you had before you'd lost the leg. So these are kind of interesting findings about, what makes people flourish, what makes people happy, and so on. And insofar as morality is connected to that, and we know it is, well, then your morality should be shaped by those kind of discoveries, it seems to me. We shouldn't just be focused on giving people more money, for example, more and more money. That's not going to help them flourish. It's not going to help them become happier or lead more content lives as a result. So I think that, there's a great deal that you can investigate and figure out in terms of morality and human flourishing without necessarily having to sign up to some grand metaphysical theory about the nature of, the metaphysical basis of moral facts, if they exist. I should also say that, I'm not entirely convinced that there are any objective moral facts. I'm kind of confused. They're really weird facts if they're out there. And it may be that they're not out there. They just really seem to us to be out there. I kind of want them to be out there. But, this isn't a game of wishful thinking. So it may be that, ultimately I'm going to have to give up on my moral facts. But I still have the same concerns. I mean, I'm still going to want to be a good person. I'm still going to want to try and help other people flourish and all of that stuff. So, even if it turned out that there is no objective moral reality out there, and I'm not sure that introducing God really helps very much on that front. But even if that turned out to be the case, it's not really going to change. It's not really going to change very much for me. Actually, I'm still going to try and be a good person.
But you're assuming that good and flourishing and all of that is objective, even if you say it's not objective.
Flourishing is objective. Yeah, no, we know that certain things. Yeah, I mean that's just a matter of objective fact. That if somebody's dying in agony, they ain't flourishing.
Right. Yeah.
We know that. That's not a matter of subjective opinion. That's just the fact. Yeah. But so you're focused very much on this kind of moral argument, and I kind of get why, because if you're dealing with a humanist, that's an atheist, somebody that doesn't believe in God, there are various ways in which you can respond to their atheism. You could give arguments for the existence of God and so on, and we could get into all of that, but it would be horribly complicated. But the more convenient way of kind of going at it is to say, but what's the metaphysical basis of morality so far as you're concerned? And so we get this day in, day out.
Well, I know you do, absolutely.
And I don't want to come up with some sort of flippant answer and say, it's just not a problem. Of course it's a problem. I mean, there are many interesting, deep problems that I've spent my career thinking about, because I'm a professional philosopher. It's just that I don't really have a pat answer, I'm afraid, and I'll leave it there.
So I'm curious, and do you think Jesus, because do you think that Jesus is presented in the Bible and also from extra biblical sources, do you think that he was ethical? Do you think he was moral? And I know you'd have a problem with the supernatural piece. You've alluded to that throughout. So like the miracles, etc. But just the other pieces of it. Do you think that he is somebody that we should look at and strive to be as an example of how we can flourish?
Yeah, maybe so. It depends. Some of the things he did and said are kind of weird, and I don't really understand what the hell's going on there. But certainly you can look to other people as exemplars and role models. It doesn't have to be Jesus, as far as I'm concerned. I consider The House at Pooh Corner one of the great moral tomes. I mean, there are some fantastic morals in Winnie the Pooh. And I don't say that is a way of sort of trying to be insulting to Christians. No, I genuinely do think that particular book has some great moral lessons in it, particularly when they try and lose Tigger at the top of in the forest. So of course there can be a lot to learn from Jesus, but and I wouldn't want to suggest otherwise. I guess one of the things I would like to ask you, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Oh, certainly.
So the last thing I said about about humanism is that we're into political secularism. We're
Right.
keen on separation of church and state. And one of the ways that this issue tends to come up in the UK, and I think in the US a lot at the moment, is some religious people are unhappy about equality legislation that requires them to do certain things. So, for example, if you're a baker, you might have to bake a cake for a gay couple that are getting married. You might be asked to do that. And then if you were to refuse, you might get into some sort of legal trouble as a result of that,
Right.
because you're discriminating against gay people. Or if you own a B&B or a hotel and people are staying with you, but it turns out a couple are gay, you might say, well, I'm sorry, but this is against my religious beliefs. I'm afraid you have to leave. Again, they're going to get into trouble with with equality legislation. This is like one of the top priorities for humanists, is this kind of issue. And I know that many Christians think that, what we're arguing from the Christian perspective is really for something very unjust, that we're stripping religious people of their freedoms and their rights. Possibly we're even persecuting Christians as a result of that. And I was just wondering how you felt about that separation of church and state issue.
I was beginning to have this interview come to an end when Dr. Law turned the table on me. He started asking me some questions from a political perspective, from a Christian political, and then we were able to have a conversation from a humanist perspective on it. So I want you to join me for part 2 of this conversation that is coming up between me and Dr. Law as we discuss Christianity and humanism from a perspective. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed part 1. If you liked it, please subscribe, and whether you're listening to it, follow us. However you are listening to this podcast, this show, please do so. And thank you so much, and God bless you.